It began in the middle of a Tuesday, one of those days that feel like filler episodes in the sitcom of life, when I stood before the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for rearranging expired canned beans. My mind wandered through irrelevant corridors. Taxes, a pigeon with only one eye that stared at me every morning. And just as my consciousness floated far enough away to forget my body existed, I felt an abrupt shift in my mouth. No pain, no drama, just a peculiar sensation, as though something politely detached itself. I spat, expecting toothpaste foam, but instead, there it was, my molar, sitting at the bottom of the sink like a freshly evicted tenant. I bent closer, squinting, not fully alarmed yet, more puzzled than anything, until I noticed a subtle movement on its root. A tiny, glistening film blinked open, a wet, reddened eyelid stretching over a dark, glossy eye, embedded where enamel should have been, and it was staring directly into me. Not at me, into me, as if it recognized every poor decision I'd made since fifth grade. I tried to rationalize it, but the human brain wasn't designed to catalog this kind of thing. It wasn't even panic I felt. It was rejection, a refusal to accept this moment as real. And then the tooth, in its infinite violation of logic, opened what I can only describe as a mouth and spoke. The voice was wet gravel soaked in forgotten regrets, murmuring a slow, deliberate hello. The room shrank. Not literally, but in that way dreams fold around you when they become too heavy. "You dropped me," it said with passive accusation. "Very rude." I didn't respond because my tongue had wrapped itself around my uvula like a noose of flesh, stunned into silence. "Pick me up," the tooth instructed, more irritated than menacing. "We have paperwork." I picked it up. It was warm, uncomfortably warm, as if it had been incubating truths humans weren't meant to touch. From its base, two stubs emerged, stretching into limbs far too human, yet impossibly wrong. Fingers with too many knuckles, nails on both sides. One of them held a scroll. The scroll unrolled itself without a breeze. The parchment smelled of scorched sugar, and teeth left too long under pillows. Words oozed across its surface in a script that didn't belong to any known language, yet every syllable echoed in my mind with a dreadful clarity. "Sign it," the tooth said. "With blood, of course. Ink doesn't bind in the underlayer." I looked at my reflection, which wasn't quite mine anymore. It mouthed something I couldn't hear, eyes filled with a tiredness that didn't come from sleep. I pricked my finger with one of the tooth's nails, and the parchment drank the drop like a lover's kiss. Lines began to glow. Clause 1. Your mouth will become a voting district for voices no one else hears. Clause 2. You are not to name the moth that will crawl from your ear each solstice. Clause 3. All clocks in your home must be turned to face the walls during meals. Clause 4. You will dream of oceans, but only ones filled with hair. There were more, scrolling endlessly. Rules without reason. Threats disguised as riddles. I signed without blinking. The contract shivered and wrapped itself around my wrist like a wet bandage. The tooth laughed, not audibly, but inside my skull, vibrating through bone and memory. It curled into itself, melting like wax, seeping into my skin until nothing was left but a faint metallic taste on my tongue and a sudden pressure deep in my jaw, rhythmic and steady, like someone knocking from the inside. The knocking didn't stop. It was methodical, almost polite, as though whoever or whatever had taken up residence in my jaw was determined to maintain some twisted sense of etiquette. I stood there for hours, maybe minutes. Time had become irrelevant, replaced by this new internal metronome that tapped against my nerves like a blind man finding his way through an unfamiliar cathedral. I tried to speak, but my words came out sideways, slipping from my lips in unfamiliar tones, laced with vowels that didn't exist yesterday. My tongue no longer obeyed me. It moved with independent purpose, curling into shapes I didn't authorize, occasionally whispering syllables into the air that smelled faintly of sulfur and wilted flowers. That night, I didn't sleep. I simply closed my eyes and watched the colors beneath my eyelids bloom into impossible landscapes. Deserts filled with screaming eggs, staircases made of fingers, clouds shaped like regrets. Every time I drifted close to unconsciousness, I heard the voice of the tooth again, closer now, clearer, reciting portions of the contract in a soothing corporate tone, reminding me of my obligations. Clause 9. You must refer to your own reflection as lieutenant for the duration of winter. Clause 14. Avoid stepping on cracks after sundown. They are no longer metaphorical. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound came from beneath my skin. By morning, the bathroom mirror had changed. It no longer reflected me, but rather a version of myself with all the wrong details. A smile 2 inches too wide, pupils that dilated in slow spirals, a head that nodded when I remained still. I asked it questions, like a fool. What is this? Am I dying? It answered by tilting its head and whispering, You signed, didn't you? Then it winked with all its teeth. I went to work. Or rather, I arrived at the building where I performed tasks in exchange for money. But I was no longer present. My co-workers looked at me with hollow eyes, their mouths chewing nothing, their screens filled with static and the faint outline of a molar in the corner. I opened my email, and instead of messages, I found a single attachment, a PDF titled Second Phase. I opened it against every instinct I had left. It contained only a single sentence. Let it out. That's when my jaw unhinged. Not metaphorically. Literally. A clean, precise dislocation, like a door being opened from the inside. My scream didn't come from me. It came from the thing behind my teeth, a chorus of wet voices singing in reverse. My co-workers didn't react. One of them clapped slowly, rhythmically, eyes glazed over like sugar-coated marbles. I rushed to the restroom. The mirror had changed again. It now displayed a small, windowless room with a single chair and a spotlight dangling above it. Sitting in the chair was a younger version of myself, perhaps 8 years old, missing the exact molar I'd lost the day before. He looked up and said, You're late. Then he held out a second contract. I reached for it, but my hand passed through the glass. My reflection, now fully separate from me, remained still and unblinking. The mirror grew cold to the touch, vibrating slightly as though an engine were humming behind it. You missed your appointment, the reflection whispered. The tooth is disappointed. Back at home, the knocking intensified. It wasn't just inside my jaw anymore. It echoed through the walls, the floor, the furniture. My toothbrush was gone, replaced by a tiny pickaxe. The sink was full of salt. The wallpaper peeled itself into symbols I couldn't read but felt deep in the gums. I didn't resist anymore. I opened my mouth and waited. Something inside stirred. Not a creature. Something worse. An idea. Fossilized and angry. It climbed slowly, scraping its way toward the light. And with every inch it gained, I forgot a memory. My mother's voice. The smell of bread. The warmth of rain. All exchanged for this presence. This tooth-born verdict. When it finally emerged, half bone, half thought, it looked at me with my own eyes and said, Let's begin the extraction. The extraction wasn't surgical. It was ceremonial. I was no longer in my apartment. Or perhaps I was. But the apartment had molted, shed its pretense of normalcy like a cicada skin peeled away to reveal something infinitely older and less comprehensible. The walls had turned porous, throbbing gently as though breathing through unseen lungs. The ceiling was gone, replaced by a vast, pulsing gum line that stretched across an infinite pink sky. My furniture had transformed into tools. Dental tools, archaic and ceremonial, some made of ivory, others of rusted memory. The couch clicked open like a jaw. My fridge was humming in Latin. I stood barefoot on what used to be my rug, but now felt suspiciously like tongue. It was warm, wet, and pulsing beneath my toes. In the center of the room, the thing that had crawled from my mouth stood upright. Not a person, not a creature, more like a consequence with legs. Its body was a shifting composite of molars, canines, and wisdom teeth fused together in unnatural geometry. Its hands dripped anesthesia. Its eyes were old dental records etched into glass. It gestured toward the chair that used to be my childhood fear, now very real, very tall, and covered in leather that whispered to itself. I sat. The straps secured themselves, not forcefully, gently, almost lovingly, like an embrace you didn't know you agreed to. The creature leaned in, pressing a single finger, a tiny baby tooth, against my forehead. I remembered recess, and then forgot it. I remembered the first time I lied to avoid brushing, and then forgot that too. "This will hurt," it said, in a dozen voices layered atop each other, none of them human, all of them patient, but only in the parts of you that still believe in comfort. From its own chest, it pulled a document. Not parchment this time, but something writhing, flesh paper, stitched together from contracts signed in sleep. The clauses no longer required reading. They were absorbed, understood, lived. My bones tingled as they began to reconfigure. My spine grew extra vertebrae, each one inscribed with a decision I once avoided. My teeth realigned into new constellations of meaning. They hummed softly. The being began the extraction, not of teeth, but of certainties. It reached into my mouth and pulled out my belief in causality. It held it up to the light, sniffed it, and crushed it between its fingers. Then it reached again, deeper, and extracted my memory of the color blue. I whimpered, not because I missed it, but because I could no longer describe the sky. Then came my understanding of names, of ownership, of mornings, all gone, all filed into a translucent briefcase sealed with gums. My body remained limp but aware. Somewhere behind me, the door to my apartment opened and closed. Someone entered. A neighbor, maybe. Someone who once borrowed my plunger. They screamed when they saw me, not in terror, but recognition. "It's happening to you too," they whispered before dissolving into a puddle of saliva and unpaid bills. The being looked satisfied. "Phase 3 is complete," it said. Then it vomited a set of dentures onto my lap. The dentures were mine, but not yet. They belonged to a future version of me who had lost everything, even the illusion of sequence. They chattered idly, gnashing invisible food. My reflection returned, standing behind the creature, holding a clipboard. It checked something off and nodded. Then it smiled, revealing a mouth full of tiny chairs. "Now you can speak," it said, and I realized it was right. I could, so I did. I opened my mouth and spoke the first sentence in a new language, a tongue made entirely of molar clicks, incisor scrapes, and gingival sighs. The walls leaned in to listen. The room applauded softly with unseen gums. Somewhere in the distance, a dentist wept for reasons they would never explain. And for the first time since the contract began, I felt useful. Useful, yes, but not in the way humans understand it. Not in the way society packages purpose like cereal boxes lined on sterile supermarket shelves. No, this usefulness was more primal, more ancestral. I was now a cog in a machine older than language, a participant in an economy that traded in memories, sensations, and moral decay. The molar-clad creature, my emissary, my executioner, my mentor, extended one final tendril toward my chest and inserted a small bicuspid just below my sternum. I didn't resist. It nestled itself into the soft tissue like a seed into soil, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, then slowly beat faster until my own rhythm bent to match it. That's when the room began to rotate, not around a fixed point, but inward, folding upon itself like a house closing into a mouth, the walls becoming cheeks, the ceiling a palate, the floor a trembling tongue. I was swallowed whole by my own home. The descent was not violent, but it was wet and long and filled with whispers in the shape of apologies I'd never made. I landed softly on what I hoped was not a uvula. Now I was underground, or inside something. A massive chamber, hollow and alive, lined wall to wall with molars arranged like mosaic tiles. The light was low but persistent, glowing from between the teeth as if they were filled with unsaid truths. I walked, barefoot, toward the only object in the room, a reception desk carved from plaque and regret. Behind it sat a woman with floss for hair and a jaw that clicked every time she smiled, which was constantly, mechanically. She didn't ask my name. She didn't have to. "You're early," she said, thumbing through a manila folder filled with paper made from chewed gum. "But that's expected. The contract matures faster in the morally disoriented." I didn't know what to say. My tongue still wasn't mine. It coiled, then hissed, then muttered, "Show me the next phase." She nodded, pressed a decaying button on her desk, and a door opened, not with hinges, but by bleeding slightly along its edges and curling backward. Beyond the door was a hallway filled with mirrors, dozens of them, each angled to show me not who I was, but who I could have been. Me as a dentist, me as a janitor, me as a man who didn't pick up the tooth, me with a full smile, holding hands with someone I no longer remembered. I stopped in front of one mirror, touched the glass, and it bit me, not figuratively. The mirror cracked open, revealed a set of gums, and took a gentle, polite nibble out of my fingertip. "You mustn't linger," the receptionist said from far behind, though I hadn't heard her move. "Those lives don't want to be seen." I continued. The hallway led into a small auditorium carved entirely from enamel. The seats were filled with people I knew but couldn't name. Their faces were familiar, yet rearranged. My first-grade teacher with the eyes of my ex. My landlord with the hands of my childhood dog. Each of them held a clipboard and observed me with professional detachment. On the stage, another version of me. This one was clean-shaven, eyes wild, jaw wired shut. He tried to speak, but could only grunt through clenched, rusted braces. I understood him anyway. He was asking me to run, not away, from, not to, toward. He didn't know where, only that I had to move. I didn't. I sat in the front row as the lights dimmed, and the version of me on stage began to pull at his mouth. The wires snapped. Blood, thick like syrup, flowed into the microphone. He began to recite the clauses of the contract again, but this time they were sung in a melody that sounded like a child gargling soap. The audience clapped. I clapped. Something deep within me clapped. A voice from behind whispered, "You're almost ready." I turned, and it was the original tooth, reborn now, the size of a man, dressed in a lab coat made of receipts. It held a clipboard and grinned, revealing a tongue covered in signatures. "Ready for what?" I asked. It leaned in. "To meet the one who chewed you into existence." The revelation didn't crash over me like a wave. It dripped, slow and sour, into the cracks of my remaining sanity. To be chewed into existence implies a process, a digestion. I wasn't born. I was masticated. I was gnashed into being by something with molars older than time, something that doesn't bite to consume, but to sculpt. The creature in the lab coat, once a tooth, now a professor of my undoing, motioned for me to follow. His footsteps didn't echo. They squelched, each one releasing the faint sound of a childhood secret being regurgitated. We left the auditorium of distorted familiars, passed through a vestibule made entirely of wisdom, teeth humming lullabies to forgotten dreams, and entered what could only be described as a cathedral of jaws. Hundreds of them, hanging from the ceiling like chandeliers, each one snapping open and shut in some long-lost Morse code. I tried to decipher their rhythm, But my thoughts were tangled. My internal monologue now spoke with a lisp, and the lisp belonged to the tooth, not to me. Ahead stood the altar. It was not raised, but sunken, dug deep into a pit of receding gums that throbbed with anticipation. At its center, a throne fashioned from baby teeth, pacifiers, and milk-stained bibs, and on that throne sat the being who had chewed me into existence. It had no eyes, but it saw. It had no mouth, but it spoke, not in words, but in sensations. The taste of copper, the smell of burnt popcorn, the texture of unbrushed shame. Every second in its presence peeled away a layer of pretense from my soul. It gestured with a hand made of toothbrushes and bones, and I stepped closer. My body moved like a string puppet handled by a dentist with theological intentions. I knelt, not out of reverence, but inevitability. The being placed a finger, a giant, yellowed canine, on my forehead, and I felt all my baby teeth grow back at once. Not in my mouth, but in my spine, sprouting like anxious tumors. The tooth beside me spoke. This is the chewer. It doesn't remember creating you, but it doesn't deny it either. That is its nature. It chews. Some become pulp. You became possible. I tried to ask why. Why me? Why now? But my voice came out in toothpaste. The chewer tasted it, and for a moment I glimpsed its approval. My jaw unhinged again, wider than before, and from within me erupted not sound, but a perfect dental mold of my childhood home. It fell to the floor and shattered into 1,000 cavities. The chewer stood, not quickly. Its rise was tectonic, each movement causing molars in the cathedral to chatter with reverence. It descended the throne and walked toward me, leaving footprints shaped like toothbrushes in melting linoleum. When it reached me, it handed me a gift, a retainer case. Inside, a single incisor floated in honey. "Your seed," said the tooth guide. "Plant it." I nodded. The next room was a garden. Soil made of plaque, flowers with tongues, bees that buzzed in gingivitis. I dug with my hands, scooping decay and regret to make a small hole. I placed the incisor inside. It screamed once, softly, and then rooted. Vines erupted, wrapping around my arms, whispering promises of futures I hadn't authorized. "You're blooming now," said the guide. "This is what comes next." "What comes next?" I asked. It leaned in, close enough that I could smell its breath, the exact scent of my grandmother's attic. "You will be harvested." Harvested. The word didn't sit. It burrowed, nested, curled into a fetal position somewhere behind my eyes. The garden around me breathed in slow, congested rhythms, as though each petal was struggling under the weight of its own awareness. I watched the incisor I'd planted throb once, then split open like a pomegranate, releasing tiny replicas of my face that crawled into the soil, chattering softly in languages composed entirely of apologies and dental X-ray codes. The vines gripping my arms tightened, not to restrain, but to remind. My body no longer belonged to chronology. It belonged to the root system now. The tooth being, who had once been an annoyance in my sink, now a prophet of gingival truths, pointed toward a distant hill where trees shaped like molars loomed against a jaundiced sky. "There," it said, "is where the harvester waits." I tried to walk, but my legs were numb with plaque, so I crawled, hands in rot, knees kissing the tartar-covered ground. As I moved, the garden responded. Flowers turned their heads to watch me. Pollen whispered secrets into my eardrums, and the wind tasted like mouthwash gone sour. Atop the hill stood the harvester. It wore overalls stitched from extracted nerves, boots made from compressed childhood braces, and in its hand was a sickle shaped like a smile. Its eyes were lidless and vibrating, like overworked dental drills. It didn't speak, not at first. It simply gestured toward the hole I had left behind, the incisors' grave. "You fed it, you," it said eventually, in a voice that echoed with the cadence of every dentist I had ever lied to. "Now it's time for you to feed it back." I was given a watering can. Inside, tears from all the nights I cried as a child because of the dark, the dentist, or the slow realization that my parents didn't understand me. I poured it over the soil. The ground convulsed, bloomed, screamed. Roots burst forth and dragged my feet into the earth up to my ankles. "Still," said the harvester, "you'll feel the tug. That's normal." I felt the tug. It started in my molars, the new ones, the ones grown in my spine, and then spread to my temples, my throat, my lungs. My thoughts thickened, congealed. I could no longer think in sentences, only textures. I remembered my first kiss, but only how it smelled. I remembered my first heartbreak, but only how it tasted, like aluminum foil and swallowed screams. The harvester pressed a hand to my chest. It hummed. "Your soul is ripe," it said. "We will now extract it via the gums." It reached into its coat and pulled out an object I recognized instantly. A floss pick, green, the cheap kind, the kind I never used. It inserted it not into my mouth, but into my navel, and began to work it in gentle, circular motions. I didn't resist. I uncoiled. Inside me, there was a knot, tight, ancient, shaped like my first lie, and the floss slid into it like a key into a lock. Click! I collapsed backward, but the vines caught me, cradled me, rocked me, and then I was above my body, floating, watching as the harvester slowly wound a spool of soul floss around its fingers, careful not to snap it. My body below twitched gently, as if dreaming of a life where none of this had happened, where teeth stayed teeth and didn't talk, where mirrors didn't blink. From above, I saw the garden bloom again. Each flower now bore my face, frozen in expressions I didn't recognize. Laughing, sobbing, gagging, screaming. The harvester looked up at me and smiled with every tooth I had ever lost. "You were a perfect extraction," it said, and I believed it. I drifted, suspended in an ether that smelled faintly of fluoride and stale birthday cake. I was no longer tethered to form. My consciousness had dissolved into a gentle foam, bubbling across the ceiling of reality like breath on a cold mirror. Below me, the garden pulsed in rhythm with an unseen jaw, chewing not objects, but concepts, biting down on comfort, masticating the illusion of linear time, grinding hope into fine powder. I was content for a moment, floating in that antiseptic haze, until I noticed the sound. It started as a faint hum, like someone humming through clenched teeth, but then grew, harmonic, layered, dissonant. It was my name, but fractured, pronounced in every way it had ever been mispronounced by substitute teachers, automated systems, and lovers who never really knew me. The sound curled around me and pulled. Suddenly, I wasn't above anymore. I was falling, folding, re-threading back into meat. I landed hard, gasping. Not on earth, but on a floor tiled with baby teeth, slick with regret. I looked around. I was in a waiting room. Not the kind with magazines and soft music, but a chamber of suspended time, where every chair had arms, and those arms had fingernails. A ticking sound echoed from nowhere, and a receptionist with a head shaped like a toothbrush offered me a clipboard. "You're late," it said, though I had no memory of being invited. The form asked a single question. "Do you accept the terms of your reconstitution?" I hesitated, pen trembling in my hand. "If you don't sign," the receptionist whispered, "you remain oral residue." I signed. Immediately, the walls around me peeled back like gums in recession, and I was ushered through a hallway paved with forgotten floss. My guide was a molar in a trench coat, eyes obscured by dark lenses made from scratched retainers. "You'll experience some bleeding," it said casually. "That's expected when reforming in a place with this much narrative plaque buildup." We arrived at a room labeled Reintegration Chamber 4B, Personality Resurfacing and Tartarus echo calibration. Inside, dozens of people, versions of me, sat in rows, each wearing different expressions: suspicion, arousal, contempt, curiosity. One looked up at me and sneered. "Back already?" it asked. "Didn't last long, did you?" I took my seat 32, still warm from someone who no longer existed. An intercom crackled. "Congratulations on surviving extraction," it said in a flat, minty tone. "Please prepare for the next stage, chewing through the layers of self." The lights dimmed. The walls began to rotate slowly. The air filled with the thick scent of boiled enamel. A screen dropped from the ceiling, and a training video played. Footage of me brushing my teeth as a child. Sped up, looped, reversed, slowed, distorted. My mother stood in the background, head replaced by a cavity, whispering instructions I couldn't quite remember, but deeply feared. And then, the test. A tray was placed before me, holding 5 teeth. Each one vibrated softly, emitting faint music. I was instructed to choose the one that hurt the most. I reached instinctively for the one shaped like my first heartbreak, but my hand hovered instead over the one that tasted like guilt. As I touched it, it exploded into 1,000 whispering slugs, each one oozing down my arms and into my ears. They told me stories about myself I'd never heard, but knew were true. "You lied about brushing in 8th grade. You kissed someone you shouldn't have in college. You enjoyed watching the blood when your gums bled." When the lights came back, I was the only one left in the room. The other seats were empty. Or maybe they had always been? I stood, different now. My limbs moved with hesitation, as though uncertain whether I was still real. My breath fogged the mirror on the wall, and in it I saw a new version of myself, taller, translucent, smiling with a mouth full of contracts. The reflection stepped out of the glass and extended its hand. "You're ready for the final bite," it said, and without hesitation, I took it. The final bite wasn't into food or flesh or even fabric of reality. It was into an idea, ancient and rotten, wrapped in sweetness. As my teeth sank into it, I felt them splinter, not with pain, but with relief, like they had waited my whole life to crumble this way. The moment of contact sent a wave through me, like biting down on a fork by accident, except the fork was made of childhood fears, and the metal was every unsaid apology I'd swallowed to keep the peace. I closed my eyes, but what I saw wasn't darkness. It was plaque in its purest form, a sticky, living archive of everything I'd chosen to ignore. Images flickered, me skipping dentist appointments, me chewing pen caps while thinking about death, me smiling at funerals because I didn't know what else to do. These images weren't memories. They were consequences. I wasn't remembering them. I was being judged by them. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer standing. I was seated on a carousel that rotated not horizontally, but vertically, like the wheel of a giant invisible rodent grinding time between its molars. Each rotation revealed another version of me, sitting in the same pose, biting into something different. One had a slice of cake, another a light bulb, another a Bible soaked in spit. One bit into nothing and still screamed. A voice everywhere and nowhere said, "The bite is never about hunger. It's about consent." I nodded, not because I understood, but because my jaw moved on its own now. The reflection that had taken my hand earlier was gone, replaced by a dentist's chair made entirely of baby car seats and breath mints. I sat, obviously. There were no choices anymore, just procedural steps in a ritual older than saliva. From the ceiling descended a drill, humming with the same tone as my father's disappointed sighs. It didn't bore into my teeth, it bored into my thoughts. Thoughts about morality, thoughts about value, thoughts about flossing and its symbolic connection to intimacy. Every rotation stripped a layer of personality, leaving me slick, raw, glistening with honesty I hadn't asked for. The drill whispered, "You are almost polished." Then came the rinse. It wasn't water. It wasn't even liquid. It was a flood of tongue-shaped shadows that entered through my ears and exited through my pores. They took with them fragments of hesitation, compassion, the flavor of rain. What remained was sterile, pristine, prepped. A curtain opened, somewhere far ahead, and I was ushered onto a stage shaped like a bicuspid. The audience was a crowd of jaws, some human, some not, snapping gently in anticipation. A spotlight hit me, and a microphone rose from the floor. The tooth being reappeared, now wearing a cape made of dental bibs, and gestured for me to speak. I cleared my throat, which now echoed, not acoustically, but spiritually. "I am the bite," I said. Applause erupted, not sound, but pressure. The audience inhaled in sync, pulling the air from my lungs, replacing it with something colder. Truth, maybe. Or fluoride. From the back of the theater, a hand rose, not attached to a body, just a hand, floating, old and yellowed like paper left in the sun. It held a single question card. "What have you learned?" I paused. I thought of mirrors that chew, of teeth that file contracts, of gardens that scream, of mothers with cavity faces and drills that vibrate with emotional neglect. And I answered, "I learned that nothing is ever really swallowed. It all stays. It all returns." Silence. Then, the lights dimmed, the floor beneath me softened into gum, and I began to sink, slowly, inevitably, into the final layer, the roots. The roots welcomed me like a mother who had never been human. They were thick, pulsating strands of calcified thought and compressed regrets, curling around my limbs with tender insistence. As I sank deeper, the world above shrank into a cavity, one I had once mistaken for safety. Down here, time didn't pass. It receded, sucked backward into soft crunches and subterranean murmurs. The soil wasn't soil, but old enamel dust mixed with bedtime prayers, whispered too late to matter. I could hear the others, those who had bitten before me. Their voices floated through the roots like static through braces, fractured, echoing, familiar. They hummed songs from dentist waiting rooms, chanted the terms of their contracts in a loop, wept over memories of ice cream and bleeding gums. I didn't join them. Not yet. I still had one more extraction. Myself. The root system probed gently into my chest and pulled, not with violence, but with inevitability. My spine cracked like a wishbone, and out came something small, shivering, shaped like a molar but throbbing like a heart. It was me, the part of me that hadn't signed the contract, the part that still believed in logic, kindness, bedtime. I held it in my hands. It tried to bite me. "I forgive you," I whispered, and placed it back into the dirt. The roots closed. The air thickened. Darkness took form, not as emptiness, but as fullness, so complete it suffocated. I felt myself stretch, swell, then snap, like gum chewed too long. And then I was spit out, onto a sidewalk, outside a grocery store. Midday. Pedestrians walked past, unbothered by the blood at the corners of my mouth, or the thick root mud caked on my feet. A child pointed. Her mother pulled her away. I checked my reflection in a car window. My smile was still mine, but wider, cleaner, hungrier. I walked home in silence. My apartment hadn't changed, except now the mirrors bowed when I entered. The fridge whispered recipes. The toothbrush leaned slightly toward me, reverent. I opened the drawer where I kept my contracts. All blank now, all white, ready. And I knew I would not stop here. There are other teeth, other mouths, other stories that have not yet bitten themselves into being. So now, to you, yes, you, watching this with lips slightly parted and jaw beginning to ache, ask yourself, when was the last time you checked your teeth? Really checked? Because if one falls out, don't pick it up. Don't listen. Don't sign. But if you already did, then welcome. You're part of the bite now. And before your next dream starts, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and leave a comment down below telling us what your reflection whispered last night. We'll be watching and chewing.